The truth will set you free. I don't know how else to start this video, but I'm presenting two of them. One from a young girl at her perspective going through the school system and being brainwashed, and how she found the truth about what really is the slave trade. And the second one is called They Were Whites and They Were Slaves: The Untold History of the Enslavement of Whites in Early America. It's time to learn a little bit of truth and break the chains of slavery in your mind.
Trigger warning. This video contains reality and may be extremely upsetting to the very sensitive. Viewer discretion is advised. Slavery is quite an upsetting topic for many. In school, I started learning about African slavery at a very young age. I think I was first taught about it in grade 3. When Black History Month rolled around, my black teacher, Miss Davis, ranted about how whites enslaved blacks and how we should feel bad. Later on, in grade 6, they made us read this book in class about an African slave girl who was taken from her homeland by white slave owners to be abused by southern redneck slave masters. Miss Davis, other black activists, and my school history books were quite inaccurate. Unfortunately, many white people are infected by this mental disease known as white guilt. Many black activists and guilty whites outright deny that Africans sold their own people into slavery, even though there is a lot of undeniable evidence. In fact, Africans were enslaving each other for thousands of years, even before the US was formed, and many countries in Africa still practice slavery today. Tipu Tip was a world-famous black slave trader in Zanzibar. The Leo people captured other Africans in war and sold them into slavery. Barack Obama himself descended from the Leo people, by the way. There are in fact more Africans enslaved in Africa today than in all of US history. In the last decade, slavery in Sudan has made a comeback. Despite the suspension of the capture of Sudanese slaves as a result of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005, over 35,000 slaves remain in bondage in northern Sudan. According to the American Anti-Slavery Group, black Africans in southern Sudan have been abducted for centuries in the Arab slave trade. Government-armed Arab militias are known to kill the men and enslave the women and children as personal property, or to march them north to be auctioned and sold. In Mauritania, slavery persists even though the government repeatedly banned it. It's unknown exactly how many Africans are enslaved in this country. Estimates range wildly. At least 90,000 darker-skinned Africans still live as the property of the Muslim Berber communities. Other estimates, perhaps using a broader definition, claim up to 600,000 men, women, and children, or 20% of the population, are slaves to North African Arabs. This percentage of slaves is the highest in the world. Sex slavery is a huge problem in many African countries like South Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, northern Uganda, Congo, Niger, and Mauritania and Sudan, as I mentioned above. In Ghana, Togo, and Benin, a form of religious forced prostitution known as troisi forcibly keeps thousands of girls and women in traditional shrines as wives to the gods, where priests perform the sexual function in place of the gods. And it's not only Africans being enslaved in Africa. Many Chinese prostitutes are trafficked into Ghana to service communities in the country. Victims are recruited under the guise of working as restaurant assistants. They are then confined and forced to provide sexual services. Children are also victims of slavery in Africa today. Children are kidnapped and sold for $20 to $70 each. They are sold into sex dens or as unpaid domestic servants in wealthier oil-rich states, such as Nigeria and Gabon. At least white countries outlawed slavery a long time ago. Slavery is still practiced in Africa today despite efforts to ban it, and it was practiced hundreds of years ago. The United Nations estimate that roughly 27 to 30 million people are enslaved today around the world. In 1990, the Human Rights Watch reported that routine slave punishments for the slightest fault include beatings, denial of food, and prolonged exposure to the sun with hands and feet tied together. Serious infringement of the master's rule were met with a variety of tortures, including insect treatment where tiny ants were stuffed into the victim's ears, which are sealed with rocks and bound with a scarf. Hands and feet are tied and the errant slave is left for days, after which the rights group reports he will do what is told. If you still don't believe me, I have sources in the description below. Whites were actually the first people to stop slavery in modern times, yet white people are exclusively blamed for historical slavery. In the 16th and 18th century, Africans enslaved 1.5 million white Europeans in the Barbary slave trade. Yet you don't hear white people crying out for reparations. African Muslims raided up the coastlines of Europe, kidnapping and enslaving white European Christians. The men were galley slaves and the women were sex slaves. This was way more brutal than working on a plantation or as a domestic servant. When I was younger, I would hear about whites literally going into Africa and rounding up the slaves, but that was not true at all. Nearly all modern historians agree that European slave traders always bought slaves from the African vendors at coastal markets. Europeans didn't even have to get off their ships to buy slaves. It was like going into the McDonald's drive-thru. Those slaves were already at the slave market in chains ready to go. We hear about the brutal Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, but never hear about the estimated 10 million so indigenous Africans who perished while being marched to sea, in chains and yokes by their African captors. Now let's talk about slavery in America. Of the 10 to 15 million Africans who were transplanted into the New World, no more than 6% or around 400,000 went to the Northern Hemisphere. Almost all of them went into South America. So that means about 94% of slaves were transported across the Atlantic to serve Hispanic slave owners. But we don't look at Hispanics as evil slave owners. At the peak of black slavery in the South, only 5% of Southern whites owned slaves. If you include the white people of the North, it means only 1.4% of white Americans owned slaves. Jewish Americans were the biggest slave owners in America per capita, but Native Americans and other blacks owned slaves in America as well. In fact, the first slave owner in the 1600s, USA, was a black man named Anthony Johnson. An estimated 3,000 blacks owned a total of 20,000 slaves in the year in 1860 in America. One study concluded that 28% of free blacks owned slaves, which was a far higher percentage than that of free whites. Through my research, I was constantly wondering, why don't black activists ever talk about this shit? It seems like the majority of the population has no concept of history or facts, due to the media and our schools censoring reality. Through telling the lie of the white slave trade, they have installed crippling guilt into the white population. Guilt is a very powerful historical weapon used to weaken and demoralize the people. In history, all races have done terrible shit. We should not be guilted by the mistakes of our ancestors. I hope that after this video, the white people watching don't feel that guilty anymore. Thanks for watching, guys, and stay sane.
So Michael Hoffman wrote this work entitled They Were White and They Were Slaves. I'm going to do my best to read this in a clear, concise voice, not screwing up too many words, and I would encourage you to share this with anyone you know who is still suffering from white guilt, who has bought the lie that the white people are somehow this plague on humanity and have done nothing but ruin everything around them. Utter garbage, nonsense, bull. And I don't care if you take this video and if you cut it down, if you want to cut out my introduction, because I know often my introductions are long-winded. I oftentimes have a lot to say before I get started on something. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. But the meat of this, the book, this stuff is important because it shows evidence that is clearly contradictory to the tired argument that somehow us white people of Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Teutonic, Caucasian heritage are somehow at the core of the problem, when that couldn't be further from the truth. So they were white and they were slaves. The untold history of the enslavement of whites in early America by Michael A. Hoffman II. And incidentally, Michael Hoffman has a website, Revisionist History. I think it's revisionisthistory.org. You can get more information from him. Lots of different works that he does. Okay, And he also has a YouTube channel, Michael Hoffman. So, the introduction. They were of two sorts. First, such as were brought over by masters of ships to be sold as servants. Such as we call them, my dear, says she, but they are more properly called slaves. Daniel Defoe, Moll Flanders. This is a history of white people that has never been told in any coherent form, largely because most modern historians have, for reasons of politics or psychology, refused to recognize white slaves in early America as just that. Today, not a tear is shed for the sufferings of millions of our own enslaved forefathers. 200 years of white slavery in America have been almost completely obliterated from the collective memory of the American people. Who wants to be reminded that half, perhaps as many as thirds, of the original American colonists came here not of their own free will, but kidnapped, shanghaied, impressed, duped, beguiled, and yes, in chains. We tend to gloss over it. We'd prefer to forget the whole sorry chapter. Elaine Kendall, Los Angeles Times, September 1st, 1985. A correct understanding of the authentic history of the enslavement of whites in America could have profound consequences for the future of the races. We cannot be sure that the position of the earliest Africans differed markedly from that of the white indentured servants. The debate has considerable significance for the interpretation of race relations in American history. Eugene D. Genovese, Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made, page 31. Most of the books on white labor in early America are titled with words like, quote, white indentured servitude, unquote, white bond servants, white servants, etc. It is interesting that white people who were bound to a condition of what became in many cases permanent chattel slavery unto death are not referred to as slaves by establishment academics. With the massive concentration of educational and media resources on the Negro experience of slavery, the unspoken assumption has been that only blacks have been enslaved to any degree or magnitude worthy of study or memorial. The historical record reveals that this is not the case. However, white people have been sold as slaves for centuries. White slavery in ancient and medieval Europe. Among the ancient Greeks, despite their tradition of democracy, the enslavement of fellow whites, even fellow Greeks, was the order of the day. Aristotle considered white slaves as things. The Romans also had no compunctions against enslaving whites, who they too termed a thing. In his agricultural writings, the 1st century BC, Roman philosopher Varro labeled white slaves as nothing more than tools that happened to have voices, instrumenti vocale. Cato the Elder, discoursing on plantation management, proposed that white slaves, when old or ill, should be discarded, along with worn-out farm implements. Julius Caesar enslaved as many as 1 million whites from Gaul, some of whom were sold to the slave dealers who followed his victorious legions. William D. Phillips, Jr., Slavery from Roman Times to the Early Transatlantic Trade, page 18. In AD 319, the quote-unquote Christian Emperor of Rome, Constantine, ruled that if an owner whipped his white slave to death, quote, he should not stand in any criminal accusation if the slave dies, and all statutes of limitations and legal interpretations are hereby set aside. The Romans enslaved thousands of early white inhabitants of Great Britain, who were known as Angles, from which we derive the term Anglo-Saxon as a description of the English race. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory I witnessed blonde-haired, blue-eyed English boys awaiting sale in a slave market in Rome. Inquiring of their origin, the Pope was told they were Angles. Gregory replied, "Non Angli, sed Angeli," which translated as not angels, but angels. When the Franks conquered the Visigoths in southern Gaul, huge numbers of whites entered the slave markets. Quote, after Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony, during which many pagan Saxons were enslaved, he set up a network of parish churches to provide for the maintenance of the priest and the church. Those living in the parish were to donate a house and land, as well as a male and female Saxon slave, to the church for every 120 people in the parish. William Phillips, page 52. Arabs and the traffic in white slaves. The trade in white slaves was one of the few sources of foreign exchange for Western European powers in a period when the East produced the goods that Europeans could not produce elsewhere. The sale of white slaves to Asia and Africa was one of the few sources of gold for European treasuries. From the 8th to the 11th century, France was a major transfer point for white slaves to the Muslim world, with Rouen being the center for the selling of Irish and Flemish slaves. Quote, at the same time that France was a transfer point for slaves to the Muslim world, Italy was occupying much of the same position. Venetians were selling slaves and timber across the Mediterranean. The slaves were usually Slavs brought across the Alps. The Venetians were the earliest successful Italian sea traders, and because profits on slave trade with the Muslims were lucrative, they resisted efforts to stop them. In return for their exports of timber, iron, and white slaves, they brought in Oriental luxury products, many fine cloths. William Phillips, page 62 and 63. The stereotype from establishment consensus history is of the Muslim slaver herding chained blacks through the desert. In fact, for 700 years, until the fall of Muslim Spain, those being herded were first and foremost overwhelmingly white. Before the 10th century, the Muslims generally bought Christian Europeans as slaves. By the 10th century, Slavs became the most numerous imported group. During the late Middle Ages, until the fall of Granada in the late 15th century, most slaves of the Muslims were Christians from the northern kingdoms. William Phillips, page 69. Quote, in the vast lands of the Eastern European steppes from the 8th to the 12th century, there was a well-developed slaving network. Slavs and Finns, called Sakaliba slaves, indiscriminately by the Muslims, entered the Muslim world by these Caspian and Black Sea routes. William Phillips, page 63 and 64. The fate of hundreds of thousands of white slaves sold to the Arabs was described in one Spanish text as, quote, atrocissima et ferocissima, or translated, the most atrocious and harsh. The men were worked to death as galley slaves. The women, girls, and boys were used as prostitutes. White males had their genitals mutilated in castration attempts, bloody procedures of incredible brutality which most of the white men who were forced to submit did not survive. Judging from the high-priced white eunuchs commanded throughout the Middle Eastern slave markets. Escape from North Africa and the Middle East was almost impossible, and those white slaves who were caught trying to flee were punished by having their noses and ears cut off, or worse. Early Muslim texts provide insights into the extent to which the Arabs identified Europeans with slavery, classified white slaves as animals, and even produced learned, racist disquisitions on the supposed merits of emasculated East European slaves. In his 9th century treatise on beasts, the Book of Animals, the Muslim scholar Yahis writes, another change which overcomes the eunuch of two slaves of Slavic race who are twins, one castrated and the other not. The eunuch becomes more disposed towards service, wiser, more able, and apt for various problems of manual labor. All these qualities you find only in the castrated one. On the other hand, his brother continues to have the same native torpor, the same lack of natural talent, the same imbecility common to slaves, and incapacity for learning a foreign language. Charles Verlinden, The Slave in Medieval Europe, Volume 1, page 213. Whites were also enslaved in Russia, and I do not refer here to serfdom, which was a later development. Quote, knowledge of the existence of slavery in early modern Russia is not widespread. Many people know of the existence of serfdom and confuse the two. Richard Helly, Slavery in Russia, 1450 through 1725. Page 27. Nope, 17, sorry. The White Russian Muscovites were enslaved both by Northern European raiders as well as massive slave-catching operations launched by the Mongols and the Ottoman Empire. Russians also enslaved each other to such an extent that in 1571 an official slave chancellery was established which formally codified white slavery as a Russian institution. Helly, page 118. Viking slavers. In the 9th century, the Vikings sold tens of thousands of whites to the Arabs of Spain. According to Michael Wood's book, In Search of the Dark Ages, quote, an Arab traveler of the time who came to Spain remarked on the great numbers of European slaves in harems and in the militia. The palace of the Emir of Cordoba, in particular, had many white girls. Of these unfortunate people, the Vikings were undoubtedly a major source of supply. The Arabs in Spain saw the long-term potential of this trade, and as early as the 840s sent a diplomatic mission to Scandinavia to put it on an organized basis, unquote. Another quote, The most westerly component of the early medieval slave trade in Europe was the British Isles. In the 11th century, the Vikings were active slave traders in Ireland. From Ireland, the Vikings took the slaves to be sold in Muslim Spain and Scandinavia, and even to be transported into Russia. Some may have been taken as far as Constantinople and the Muslim Middle East. William Phillips, page 63. Quote, the Norwegian slave trade was an important enough figure to appear in the 12th century tale of Tristan. Icelandic literature also provides numerous references to raiding in Ireland as a source for slaves. Norwegian Vikings made slave raids not only against the Irish and Scots, who are often called Irish in Norse sources, but also against Norse settlers in Ireland or the Scottish Isles, or even in Norway itself. Slave trading was a major commercial activity of the Viking Age. Ruth Mazo Caris, Slavery and Society in Medieval Scandinavia, page 49. The children of white slaves in Iceland were routinely murdered en masse. Caris, page 52. Before I go on to the next section, I want to just impress upon you that, of course, this white slave trade, it is cited by many sources, was in many ways the northern end of it, facilitated by Vikings. Now, with Vikings, Norman or Norsemen being also Caucasians, it just goes to show the awful way that we whites have treated one another more than anything. Just as we see the northern house of Israel and the southern house of Judah battling it out throughout the years before Israel was taken away captive or ran off because of the prophets prophesying their impending doom and captivity to Assyria. So onward. White slavery in early America. David Breon Davis, writing in the New York Review of Books, October 11, 1990, page 37, states, as late as the 14th and 15th century, continuing shipments of white slaves, some of them Christians, flowed from the booming slave markets in the northern Black Sea coast into Italy, Spain, Egypt, and the Mediterranean islands. From Barbados to Virginia, colonists showed few scruples about reducing their less fortunate countrymen to a status little different from that of chattel slaves. The prevalence and suffering of white slaves, serfs, and indentured servants in the early modern period suggests that there was nothing inevitable about limiting plantation slavery to people of African origin. And I just want to restate that last sentence in a different way, because that's very important. When this author says the prevalence and suffering of white slaves, serfs, and indentured servants in the early modern period suggests that there was nothing inevitable about limiting plantation slavery to people of African origin, I want that to sink in. That white slavery in America was so prevalent, and the other whites here that used whites as slavery and how they treated them, and again, how prolific white slaves were here in America. Says this author that because of that, there would be nothing that would make one think that specifically and only black slaves on plantations would be inevitable. One more time, what this author is saying, and this is my interpretation, is that for us today to have this idea that plantation slaves were only or predominantly black is an intentional farce of the historic record. That should be clear. So continuing. L. Rukamis, in The Sources of Racial Thought in Colonial America, states that, quote, the slave trade worked in both directions, with white merchandise as well as black. Journal of Negro History, number 52, page 251 through 273. In 1659, the English Parliament debated the practice of selling British whites into slavery in the New World. In the debate, the whites were referred to not as indentured servants, but as slaves. Whose enslavement threatened the liberties of all Englishmen. Thomas Burton, Parliamentary Diary, 1656 through 59, volume 4, pages 253 through 274. Foster R. Dulles, in Labor in America, quotes an early document describing white children in colonial servitude as, quote, crying and mourning for redemption from their slavery. Dr. Hilary McD. Beckles of the University of Hull, England, writes regarding white slave labor, quote, indenture contracts were alienable, the ownership of which could easily be transferred, like that of any other commodity. As with slaves, ownership changed without their participation in the dialogue concerning transfer. Beckles refers to indentured servitude as white proto-slavery. The Americas, volume 41, number 2, page 21. In the Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, America and West Indies of 1701, we read of a protest over the, quote, encouragement to the spiriting away of Englishmen without their consent and selling them for slaves, which hath been a practice very frequent and known by the name of kidnapping, emphasis added. In the British West Indies, plantation slavery was instituted as early as 1627. In Barbados, by the 1640s. There were an estimated 25,000 slaves, of whom 21,700 were white. Some observations on the island of Barbados. Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, page 528. It is worth noting that while white slaves were worked to death in Barbados, there were Caribbean Indians bought from Guyana to help propagate native foodstuffs, who were well treated and received as free persons by the wealthy planters. Of the fact that the wealth of Barbados was founded on the backs of white slave labor, there can be no doubt. White slave laborers from Britain and Ireland were the mainstay of the sugar colony. Until the mid-1640s, there were few blacks in Barbados. George Downing wrote to John Winthrop, the colonial governor of Massachusetts, in 1645, that planters who wanted to make a fortune in the British West Indies must procure white slave labor, out of England if they wanted to succeed. Elizabeth Donnan documents illustrative of the history of the slave trade to America, pages 125 and 126. Quote, while indentured servants were employed and treated, incidentally, exactly like slaves. Morley Ayerst, The British West Indies, page 19. The many gradations of unfreedom among whites made it difficult to draw fast lines between any idealized free white worker and a pitied or scorned servile black worker. In labor-short 17th and 18th century America, the work of slaves and that of white servants were virtually interchangeable in most areas. David R. Roediger, The Wages of Whiteness, Race and the Making of the American Working Class, page 25. In the Massachusetts Court of Assistants, whose records date to 1633, we find a 1638 description of a white man, one Giles Player, as having been delivered up for a slave. The Englishman, William Edis, after observing white slaves in America in the 1770s, wrote, generally speaking, they groan beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage. Letters from America, London, 1792. I'm going to repeat that. They groan beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage. White slaves. Governor Sharp of the Maryland colony compared the property interest of the planters in their white slaves with the estate of an English farmer consisting of a multitude of cattle. The Quock Walker case in Massachusetts in 1783, which ruled that slavery was contrary to the state constitution, was applied equally to blacks and whites in Massachusetts. Patrick F. Moran, in his historical sketch of the persecution suffered by the Catholics of Ireland, refers to the transportation of the Irish to the colonies as the slave trade. The Irish, okay? I want these things to really sink in here. The disciplinary and revenue laws of early Virginia, circa 1631 through 1645, did not discriminate Negroes in bondage from whites in bondage. William Henning, editor, Statutes at Large of Virginia, Volume 1, pages 174, 198, 200, 243, 306, for records of wills in which lands, goods, and chattels, cattle, money, Negroes, English servants, horses, sheep, and household stuff were all sold together. See the Lancaster County Records in Virginia Colonial Abstracts. Beverly Fleet, editor. Lay historian Colonel A.B. Ellis, writing in the British newspaper Argosy, May 6, 1893, quote, few but readers of old colonial state papers and records are aware that between the years 1649 and 1690, a lively trade was carried on between England and the plantations, as the colonies were then called, in political prisoners, where they were sold by auction to the colonists for various terms of years, sometimes for life as slaves. Sir George Sandys' 1618 plan for Virginia referred to bound whites assigned to the treasurer's office to, quote, belong to said office forever. The service of whites bound to Berkeley's 100 was deemed perpetual. That's forever. Lewis Cecil Gray, History of Agriculture in the Southern United States to 1860, Volume 1, pages 316 and 318. Certainly the enslaved whites themselves recognized their condition with painful clarity, as one white man named Abram, who was accused of trying to agitate a rebellion, stated to his fellows, quote, "Wherefore should we stay here and be slaves?" In a statement smuggled out of the New World and published in London, whites in bondage did not call themselves indentured servants. In their writing, they referred to themselves as, quote, England's slaves and England's, quote, merchandise. Marcellus Rivers and Oxenbridge Foyle, England's Slavery, 1659. Eyewitnesses like Pierre Labat, who visited the West Indian slave plantations of the 17th century, which were built and manned by white slaves, labeled them white slaves and nothing less. From Memoirs of Pierre Labat, 1693 through 1705, page 125. Even blacks referred to the white forced laborers in the colonies as, quote, white slaves. From Colonial Office, Public Records Office, London, 1667, number 170. Sotweed Factor, or A Voyage to Maryland, a pamphlet circulated in 1708, articulates the plight of tens of thousands of pathetic young white girls kidnapped from England and enslaved in colonial America, lamenting that, in better times, heir to this land, I was unhappy, trepanned, not then a slave, but things are changed, kidnapped, and fooled. The height of academic and media fraud is revealed in the monopolistic trademark status the official controllers of education and mass communications have successfully established between the definition of the word slave and the Negro, while labeling descriptions of the historic experience of whites in slavery a fallacy. Yet the very word slave, which the establishment's consensus school of history pretends cannot legitimately be applied to whites, is derived from the word Slav. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word slave is another name for the white people of Eastern Europe. You know, the Slavs. That's from Compact Edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, page 2858. In other words, slave has always been a term for and a definition of a servile condition of white people. Yet we are told by the professorcrats that it is not correct to refer to whites as slaves, but only as servants, even though the very root of the word is derived from the historical fact of white slavery. Is everyone paying attention yet? I do hope so. Here we go with a Holocaust against the white poor. White slavery and bondage in British colonial America cannot be fully understood without also understanding how British whites came to be dehumanized in their homeland across the sea. The desperate condition of the poor whites of Britain was most obvious in the cities. The English slums of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries were pits of white suffering. London's St. Giles was known locally as, quote, Rat's Castle, unquote. A policeman who worked the area used metaphors from the insect world to describe the conditions of the poor whites there, referring to them as, quote, vermin-haunted heaps of rags, unquote. Opening the door to a tiny shack, the policeman discovered 10, 20, 30. Who can count them? Men, women, children, for the most part naked, heaped upon the floor like maggots in a cheese, a spectral rising, unshrouded, from a grave of rags. On duty with Inspector Field. In Household Words, June 14th, 1851, pages 265 and 267. Herman Melville, in his autobiographical account of his first voyage as a sailor, described the same living death in the English port city of Liverpool in 1839. Quote, I generally passed through a narrow street called Launcelot's Hay. Once passing through this place, I heard a feeble wail. It seemed the low, hopeless, endless wail of someone forever lost. At last I advanced to an opening, to deep tiers of cellars beneath a crumbling old warehouse, and there, some 15 feet below the walk, crouching in nameless squalor, with her head bowed over, was the figure of what had been a woman. Her blue arms folded to her livid bosom, two shrunken things like children that leaned towards her, one on each side. At first I knew not whether they were alive or dead. They were dumb and next to dead with want. How they had crawled into that den I could not tell. But there they had crawled to die. I tried to lift the woman's head, but feeble as she was, she seemed bent upon holding it down. Observing her arms clasped upon her bosom, and that something seemed hidden under the rags there, a thought crossed my mind which impelled me forcibly to withdraw her hands for a moment, when I caught glimpse of a meager little babe, the lower part of its body thrust into an old bonnet. Its face was dazzling white, even in its squalor, but the closed eyes looked like balls of indigo. It must have been dead some hours. I stood looking down on them while my whole soul swelled within me, and I asked myself, what right had anybody in the wide world to smile and be glad when sights like this were to be seen? And that's Melville Redburn, his first voyage, Anchor Books edition, pages 173 through 178. Such is the course of 19 out of 20 of the fatal cases originating in deficiency of food, as they occur among the destitute poor of our large towns. The first effect of the gradual starvation to which these persons are subjected, it is a strange anomaly to see in wealthy, civilized Christian England multitudes of men living in the lowest state of physical degradation and absolutely perishing from neglect. The fact is undeniable that no inconsiderable portion of our fellow creatures is living on food and in dwellings scarcely fit for brutes, certainly worse provided for than many of our domestic animals, and that the death of numbers is accelerated or indirectly produced by gradual or protracted starvation. From Joseph Odsheed, Distress in Manchester, Evidence Tabular and Otherwise of the State of the Laboring Classes in 1840 through 1842, pages 49 and 50. Charles Darwin's uncle, factory owner Josiah Wedgwood, owned a business that worked white children for 5 years of age in a chemical factory permeated with lead oxide, a deadly poison. Wedgwood acknowledged that the lead made the children, quote, very subject to disease, unquote, but worked them anyways. The English writer Francis Trollope estimated that at least 200,000 English children were, quote, snatched away to factories, taken and lodged amid stench and stunning, terrifying tumult, driven to and fro until their little limbs bend under them, the repose of a moment to be purchased only by yielding their tender bodies to the fist, the heel, or the strap of an overlooker or overseer. That's Marcus Cunliffe, Chattel Slavery and Wage Slavery, page 73. In 1723, the Waltham Act was passed, which classified more than 200 minor offenses, such as stealing a rabbit from an aristocrat or breaking up his fish pond, a crime punishable by hanging. Starving youths 14 years old were strung up on Tyburn gallows for stealing as little as one sheep. When their bodies were cut down, their parents had to fight over them with agents of the Royal College of Physicians, who had been empowered by the courts to use their remains for laboratory dissection. The English historian William Cobbett stated in 1836, quote, the starving agricultural laborers of southern England are worse off than American Negroes. One more time, William Cobbett stated in 1836, quote, the starving agricultural laborers of southern England are worse off than American Negroes. When in 1834 English farm workers in Dorset tried to form a union in order to, quote, preserve ourselves, our wives, and our children from starvation, they were shipped into slavery in Australia for this, quote, unquote, crime. The situation of white factory workers was no better. Robert Owen declared in 1840, quote, the working classes of Great Britain are in a worse condition than any slaves in any country, in any period of the world's history. In 19th century England, tens of thousands of white children were employed as slave laborers in British coal mines. Little white boys, 7 years old, were harnessed like donkeys to coal carts and ordered to drag them through mine shafts. In 1843, white children aged 4 were working in the coal pits. In Old English cemeteries can be seen epitaphs on gravestones like one which reads, quote, William Smith, aged 8 years, Minor, died January 3rd, 1841. Now, I have to just comment real quick. Are any of you thinking a little bit about why we refer to boys and girls under the age of 18 as minors? Onward. The root of the Holocaust against the white yeomanry of Britain lies in the history of the land swindles perpetrated against them in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. As the lords obtained their rights against the king as formalized in the Magna Carta, they used them to expropriate the land rights of the yeomen by means of the writ of novel disseisin and what historian Rodney Hilton describes as other, quote, lawyer traps, unquote. Ownership was transferred to the lords. The people were allowed to remain on their ancestral lands with something akin to a sharecropper's status. By the 17th century, even this tenacity was being eroded by the introduction of the enclosure laws, which fenced off land heretofore farmed in common by the people, as the landlords began to enforce their, quote, property rights, unquote. The net effect of enclosure, though it was at first slow in coming, was the eviction of the people from the land, a process begun towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, necessitating the first poor relief, in quotes, law for able-bodied, unemployed persons known as, quote, the 43rd Elizabeth, unquote, after the year of her reign in which it had been enacted, 1601. This act transformed the old laws concerning community self-help based on voluntary local almsgiving to a general tax or rate-paying administered through the Church of England for distribution in local parishes. As noble as the intent of the law may seem, it was little more than a token measure, intended not to halt the flood of misery generated by the dispossession of the British yeoman. I apologize for mispronouncing this word. I've just never seen it in my life. yeomen, yeoman. But rather to placate the consciences of those who could see all too well the emergence of a new pattern of starvation and poverty, previously known in Britain mainly in times of war or pestilence. The introduction of the 43rd Elizabeth marked the beginning of a holocaust against the poor of Britain, justified by jurists and aristocrats, and operated in the absence of the revolution in land reform, which would have returned the farms to the people and effected the only genuine remedy for the poverty beginning to grip the working class. To alleviate the symptoms of the land dispossession, 4 systems of bondage would evolve. 1. Poor relief. 2. White slavery in the colonies. 3. The workhouse. 4. The factory system. They would all develop their special horrors, each justified by pointing to the evils intrinsic in the previous scheme to, quote, help the poor, unquote. In quotes, poor relief institutionalized the new stigma of pauperism and parasitism, which the ruling class attached to the impoverished condition of the dispossessed yeomanry as homelessness and starvation increased. quote, "It was laid down that all recipients of poor relief should be compelled to wear the letter P on their sleeves, and that they should be whipped if they neglected or refused to do so." The P stood for a word which had already acquired its lasting stigma: pauper. From Brian Inglis, Poverty and the Industrial Revolution, page 17. The next phase of quote unquote relief for indigent British whites was their enslavement in the American colonies, which was made acceptable on the basis of pauperism created by the enclosure laws and the dehumanization of the British poor as a lower order of man, when their humanity was concealed at all. Enslavement on the colonial plantations of America became a quote-unquote mercy because it transported whites of mean estate, or in today's terms, a state of being impoverished, out of the wretched streets and hovels of Britain by means of courts of assize and press gangs. I'm going to wrap this one up for today. We're at close to an hour and 10 minutes, and when we pick up, we'll be on page 8 with the subtitle, "The Political Economy of the Industrial Revolution." So, what does this mean to the history of the Caucasians, whites, specifically those of Northern and Eastern European descent, like myself, many others? People who, they work hard to get by. They work hard to support their families. The people who, from everything I can see, are the most used and victimized of any race that I'm aware of. Now, if you weren't paying attention to everything I just read, me saying what I just said will probably make you gasp. And you might wonder, how could he say that? If you weren't paying any attention to what I just read, and if you're not paying any attention to the world around you. And I have to wrap this one up with this one clear, immutable fact. This isn't going to end unless this continued voluntary slavery that we have subjected ourselves to. You see, we don't own land. We're just fooled into thinking we do. We're fooled into paying a mortgage. We're fooled into paying all kinds of usury, which is a crime as bad as murder, thinking that that is the way it goes. That is a fair and equitable system, and it is not. We are slaves, and us whites have been slaves, and our ancestors have been slaves for a very long time. Now, why is it that our race and our people have been so well proliferated throughout this country, the country to the north of us, Europe, South Africa, Australia? Why is that? And I would say It is because for some time our ancestors have turned with all of their hearts to their God. By affirming faith in His only begotten Son and Messiah, by being obedient the best as they knew how, even with many years of many people not having the Word like we do today. Most people today, on average, have probably 3 to 5 different copies and translations of the Bible, multiple commentaries on it as well. This sort of system, because our God, Yahweh, has multiplied us greatly because of the faith and service and obedience of our ancestors. Things are going to just get worse than they are now, as we can clearly see that those who are still the aristocrats, those who still have the power, those elites, they are inflicting upon us, those of other races, and stoking the fires of hatred towards us through bald-faced lies. Now we can combat this with the truth. Documents like this. That's great. But more so is our repentance, our turning back to the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By putting the faith, our faith, for the forgiveness and cleansing of our sins in His only born Son, Jesus Christ, repenting of our sins and being baptized for the remission of sins. And if you've been baptized and you are not living well, you must turn away from your sins. If you don't, not only is this going to adversely affect what life you have left, but let's go beyond you. I want you to think about the welfare and the well-being of your children and your grandchildren. Think about them. If you're not going to think about yourself, if you're not going to take care of yourself in the sense of turning to Him, He doesn't require us to be perfect as much as He requires us to continually be turning to Him. That's repentance. It is a state of being. And He will cleanse you. And He will save us, our families, our people. So until we pick this up next time, like I said, the link will be in the description. And may this be an encouragement and a lesson to not only all of you whites who have been instilled with this sense of white guilt, this foolish idiocy, but also all of you of other races, including blacks, who continually bellyache about something that you say happened to your ancestors. So because of this, you will justify being lazy and feeding off the hard work of those of us whose ancestors were more enslaved than your own, or at least just as much. All of you need to stand up and be men. You need to turn from your evils and turn towards Yahweh in faith in his Christ and start living right. Because he's the only hope for this country. He's the only hope for you. Hope that sinks in. Till next time, do well.